So, menopause then. Good times. Menopause is entangled with irresistible decay. It marks the intersection of loss and renewal, control and shifting identity. While often viewed solely as a site of decline, I want to also consider it as an illustration of decay's generative potential. So we're going to examine together three tensions around how menopause is represented and how that might impact our own decisions when you eventually get there, if you get there. I'll look at how bodies are controlled or policed, hospitality towards strange bodies, and our ecological interconnectedness. And to explore this, I'm going to engage particularly with The Change, a novel by Kristen Miller, and Flash Count Diary, which is a memoir by Dicey Steinke, as well as a variety of interdisciplinary sources, including post-colonial, queer and ecological theories. And as I'm saying this, I want to acknowledge that while I know as a woman what it's like to have my body controlled and policed, as a middle-class white cisgender woman, I also have no idea. I am still learning. Menopause both is and very much isn't the great leveller. And I'm conscious of the fact that what's helpful to me in menopause may be a survival strategy for others, born of great struggle, and I want to honour that. So menopause refers to the point where one has not menstruated for a year. Perimenopause refers to the period preceding this, when menstrual cycles and hormone levels are disrupted, and you get a wide range of other changes. It's a very long list, but possibilities may include hot flashes, brain fog, itchy skin, flooding periods, and sudden anxiety or rage. So let's think about control, first of all. On the left, you have a clip or a shot from the movie Substance, which you may have seen, where she takes this substance, it makes her young. On the right is a bottle from my shelf, which I use because I got it free, but I hate it because it's called Youthful. Menopause is frequently framed within a medical model of deficiency, disease and decay, diagnosis, symptoms and treatment. Terms such as decline, loss and dryness all, of course, only make sense where youth is treated as the normative baseline. We are urged to avoid what Robert Wilson famously termed the horror of this living decay and its culturally engendered shame. A person in menopause has less estrogen than they did while menstruating, unless they're on HRT. But whether this is a deficiency or simply an appropriate state for a person in menopause is a very different question. Neither ageing nor menopause are diseases. Nonetheless, this model of menopause is so ubiquitous that it is often taken as fact. On the one hand, medical interventions such as hormone replacement therapy offer great relief and agency. And if they can offset or delay irresistible biological decay, then why not take advantage? Which is to say, I'm not at all railing against HRT. I think HRT is great. And although I don't have time to go into it, the idea of a natural approach to menopause is, of course, also culturally situated. What I'm interested in instead is whether we take HRT or not, is this impulse towards control of our bodies, because it raises a deeper question that draws in our theme. What is the relationship between our attempts and others' attempts to control or manage our disruptive bodies in perimenopause and menopause, making the transition as invisible as possible? And how does it relate to our ideas about menopause as representing irresistible decay or even death? Capitalism is its own form of control, and Alison Downham Moore's study of the history of menopause shows the influence of economic control right from the coining of the term menopause in France by, you guessed it, male doctors at the beginning of the period that our conference today covers. She writes, "The longevity advantage of women was so great that at the beginning of the 19th century, the adult female population outnumbered men by 2 to 1, and this made older women the most important demographic for doctors' economic need for patients. This context reveals the way in which capitalism and medicine converged and continue to converge to regulate menopausal bodies, enabling them to remain economically and domestically functional while making the transition as invisible as possible. But does it leave those on HRT under the control of profit-seeking drug companies?" And then we have our own choices. It's interesting to me the relationship between our ideas about regulating, policing, controlling other bodies and the relationship we might have with our own when we experience perimenopause disruption. As our body goes through this massive transformation, our bodies are less productive, unruly, messy, and unpredictable. If, then, our impulse is to regulate, contain, and domesticate our own body, we might be curious as to where that impulse comes from. One of Kirsten Miller's characters in The Change asks these very questions, connecting her perimenopausal flooding experience with wider questions, releasing the control and rage along with the blood. The epiphany came as the blood flowed freely down her legs. She should never have tried to fight it. How many years, how much energy had she lost trying to control something that could not be controlled? How hard had she tried to fix things that simply refused to be fixed? So much fury had built up inside Jo. As I said, post-colonial queer and ecological theories offer interesting intersections here around structures and forces of bodily discipline and control, starting to explore, and so I welcome suggestions. For example, Maria Lugones critiques how colonialism deals with bodies deemed unproductive, inconvenient, or challenging to norms. And similarly, queer ecofeminist Asmai Orkia notes how Western societies have determined bodies that do not fit within the binary biological sexes as unnatural and in need of intervention. In menopause, I think these ideas can manifest as an urge to regulate, contain, and domesticate a body that is no longer behaving predictably or naturally and is challenging to norms. Through this type of lens, then, menopause might become a site of resistance. Take HRT or not, but what does it mean to rewild or re-indigenize our relationship to our bodies when they are loudly declaring our nearness to irresistible decay and challenging our autonomy? Perimenopause can challenge our sense of feeling indigenous to our bodies and create the sensation of a split, which I'm going to look at next. In these quotes, we see a sense of the body as a stranger in perimenopause, alienated, external, the sense even of a binary. In Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva defines abjection as the experience of encountering something that threatens the boundary of the self, something that is neither fully inside nor outside. The menopausal body, shifting unpredictably, bleeding unpredictably, sweating, drying out, changing, can therefore become a site of abjection, a strange body that is liminal, monstrous, and sometimes rejected. In her memoir Flash Count Diary, Darcy Steinker wonders if this sense of a split is related to the horror of decay. Quoting Julia Kristeva, she notes that abjection does not actually cut off the subject from what threatens it. On the contrary, abjection acknowledges it to be a perpetual danger. And Steinker observes, what frightens me most, decay, death, is me. But of course there are other approaches to the stranger. We can be open to difference, to learning, hospitable to the foreign and the foreigner. And so here we find another point of tension or difference between how we treat other bodies and how we might treat ourselves. We might support this ethic of hospitality and kindness towards the foreigner, the asylum seeker, the refugee, the stranger. Can we find that attitude in our relationship to our own body? And if not, why not? Might we treat our own body with hospitality, welcoming it in its changing strangeness rather than trying to suppress it? A character in The Change makes just such a shift. Commenting on her recent weight gain, another symptom, she comments, I don't know about you, but I like taking up more space. So I want to explore this briefly with 3 visual representations of women. These reflect narratives and perceptions around what counts as decay, in the face in particular, what should be hidden, decorated, and what is appropriate for age and gender. In the movie Substance on the left, directed by Coralie Farjat, the great irony is that Elizabeth's face and body are not remotely monstrous, and yet are judged abject in her context. In a poignant scene, she is shown putting makeup on only to angrily rub it off, smearing red lipstick over her face. Mexican artist Rocio Bolivar presents arguably a more horrifically satirical take on overlaying a middle-aged body with youthful beauty, since it is performed without visual special effects and prosthetics. She has tiny metal loops on her face, and she attaches hooks and plastic to draw back her skin before applying bright makeup. Both of these dial up beauty expectations of the middle-aged menopausal body, provoking disruptive questions around control, visibility, and making those expectations themselves abject. And there seems to be a certain glee in this desire to purge, and that's reflected in the quote from Bolivar. Pamela Anderson has lately become famous for not wearing makeup. She argues that it brings her a sense of freedom. From within her context, she says, sharing a bare face is an intimate gesture. Or if you're in my context, it's a Monday morning. So we see here the potential of narrative choice and freedom because of the nearness of decay, or a narrative of decay. And Jane Ussher, who writes about menopause, argues those who reject what she calls a discourse of decay are able to take up a position where the ageing female body is not experienced as a site of horror and disgust, but the very place from which power and authority spring, not despite the process of changing and ageing, but because of it. We find this again in The Change. Each middle-aged woman develops essentially superpowers, and what Tomlinson calls a subversive spirit aligned with their perimenopausal changes. So hot flashes become strength and fire, for example, and they all take up more space, becoming a more substantial woman, as one of my own research participants has put it. So finally, I want to talk about menopause as a sort of generative ecology. I don't know if you're familiar with the Barbies in the trees. This is a thing on Facebook. Someone stuck a Barbie doll in a tree and it got stuck, and now it's slowly burying the Barbie doll. So I love that image. Given what we know, and perhaps even fight for, around our interconnection with the rest of the planet and the species on it, it's interesting that we may still want to resist taking our place in that system, seeing our transformation as individual instead, and being perhaps reluctant to ultimately offer our bodies to the earth as decay and regenerate, thinking of our bodies and the planet as the home that we inhabit. When push comes to shove, are we still individualists, still distinctively human? We see Steinke struggling with this tension in her memoir between interconnection and isolating self-awareness. She argues that my fertility, we're going to look at this in two ways. So first she talks about a new fertility, extending the sense of literal fertility. She says, my fertility continues to expand. I may be even decaying a little, but rot, let's not forget, is generative. So the metaphor of expanded or blurred fertility allows imagination to flourish outside gender norms and expectations, providing a kind of rich queering of menopause, something that is vastly underexplored and I hope to explore further in the future. And finally, the sense of a shared quest. Menopause is not, or perhaps not only, an individual transformative hero's quest, any more than it's a disease to be cured. We see the necessity of community in the negotiated collaboration between the characters in Miller's The Change. Women like you have always existed. Without you, the world would be thrown out of balance. We will all have our parts to play. And in Darcy Steinke's memoir, she becomes obsessed, as she puts it, with old female killer whales, who are another species who also apparently go through menopause. And in both sources, we find a respect for, and indeed the vital importance of, diversity. And I would suggest a reminder of the need to avoid universalizing or essentializing our experience as we navigate perimenopause in community. Moving with others without falling into a politics of the same. So to conclude, I've just begun to take a critical look at how menopause is framed and could be reframed through the diversity and the affinity of post-colonial ecological and queer theory. I've challenged in three ways the contrast between how we might view and treat other bodies and how we might treat our own, through control management, through a lack of hospitality, and through static individualism. But by exposing those contradictions, I've hopefully also shown ways to challenge them. I've suggested how representations of the absurd, the extreme, and the powerfully shame-free in media and literature offers alternative and generative perspectives on this human experience. Thank you.